branded by the cattle iron in her father's barn. A Lakota chief cooled the burn and wed her. The iron was still smoking when I found her. Not found like you stumble on something. Found like the land pushed her toward me. Same way it pushes water into low ground. I was cutting across the Hartwell property. Their northeastern fence line ran close to ours, and there'd been a dispute over 200 yards of winter graze, for going on 3 years. When I heard it, not a scream I could have filed away, told myself it was a coyote or a hawk. This was a sound I had no name for, human being, making a noise they had never made before, and would never make again. Because a body only learns that particular sound once. My horse toward it. The barn doors were open and the light inside was the kind of orange that comes late afternoon in October. Dusty and slant. Father, Hollis Hartwell, was standing, with the iron handle, still in his fist, the brand end, resting in the dirt now, because he'd dropped it there. His 2 hired men were by the far wall. They weren't looking at what they'd done. That told me something about them, that they couldn't face it, which meant somewhere under the ugliness they knew. She was on her knees in the straw. Left shoulder. The smell was the kind that gets into your nose and stays there a long time. Hollis looked at me, and I looked at Hollis, and I did not say a word. I have found in my life that the times you have the most to say are the times you say nothing at all and let your face carry it. My face must have carried something he did not want to read because he stepped back. One step, just one. But he stepped back. Her name was Clara. I did not know that yet. I would learn it over the following hours, a little at a time, between silences. I got down off my horse. I walked to her. She was holding her right hand over her left shoulder, but not touching it. Hovering just above. Like her hand understood that contact would be a second wrong on top of the first one. I crouched down in the straw next to her, and I did not touch her either. I just put myself there, between her and the men, and I said quietly, "Can you stand?" It was not a question. Questions give people room to collapse into them. I said it like I believed she could, because I did. She stood. I put my hand at her elbow, barely just enough to be there, and I walked her out of that barn. I did not look back at Hollis. Looking back at a man like that gives him something. Gives him the idea that he is still the center of the moment. He wasn't. He was already behind us. Already past. My land runs from the creek bed east to the ridge line, about 6,000 acres of it. Most of it working ranch with 24 Hereford, and the rest open grass that I keep open because the elk come through in November, and I see no reason to block a thing that's been moving that way since before any fence existed. The house is timber and stone, built by my grandfather, and added to by my father and left alone by me because it was already right. 4 rooms, a long porch on the south side, and a kitchen that gets the morning sun. I am Lakota. My grandfather rode with the last of the free bands before the agency. My father was the man who learned to file a deed and hold land the way the settlers held land, because he understood that the future required both. The old ways and the new tools, neither one abandoned, both of them in the hand at once. I am what came from that. A chief, by the reckoning of my people, a landowner, by the reckoning of the county. Neither title has ever meant much to me, except as a thing I try to live up to on the days I remember to. The town called me Tall Horse. My name is Chayton, which means falcon, but the town had its own name for me, and I never corrected them because you spend a certain amount of your life deciding which corrections are worth making. I brought Clara Hartwell to my house. My housekeeper, an older Lakota woman named Winona, who had been with my family since before I was born, and who communicated mostly through the set of her mouth and the angle of her eyebrows, took one look at the situation and said nothing. She went and got clean water and cloth, and something she kept in a small tin that smelled of pine, and something else I never learned the name of. She cleaned the wound. I stood in the doorway of the room and faced the hallway, giving Clara what privacy I could while staying close enough that my presence said, "Nothing else happens to you here. It took a while. When Winona came out, she looked at me with an expression that I had learned over the years. Meant you did the right thing. Don't ruin it, she said. She'll need to stay still a few days. She'll stay. Winona nodded once and went back to the kitchen. I did not go into the room until Clara called for me. She called me by the name she had heard. Tall horse. And her voice was thin, but it was steady. That steadiness told me something about who she was. A person's voice, after something like that, tells you almost everything. She was sitting up in the bed, back against the headboard, the wound dressed, and her shirt replaced with one of Winona's old flannel ones. She had brown hair and gray eyes, and a jaw that was set in a way that made me think she had decided, somewhere in the last 2 hours, she was not going to be a person who collapsed over this. She looked at me directly. Most people in the valley did not look at me directly. They looked at a spot near me, or they looked at my shirt, or they looked at the general idea of me. She looked at my eyes. "What do you want for this?" she said. Not impolite, just direct. She had learned, I imagine, that the world ran on exchange, and she wanted to know the terms. "Nothing," I said. She held that a moment. "Men don't do things for nothing. Some men don't. I try to be a different kind of man." I paused. "It doesn't always take." She almost smiled. Almost. Corner of her mouth moved a little. "What happened?" I said. Not asking for her to justify it. Asking because I wanted to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. A man needs to know the land before he plants. She was quiet for a time. Then she said that her father had found out she'd been meeting with a man from Billings. A surveyor named Aldous Webb had come to map the property lines the previous spring. Hartwell didn't like the man, didn't like the idea of his daughter having a thought of her own about who she might spend her life with. Hartwell was the kind of man who needed to own everything around him, and his daughter was part of the around him. When she told him she intended to go to Billings, he decided to make sure she understood what she was. Property gets branded. I listened to all of this, and I felt something settle in me, low and quiet, the way a stone settles to the bottom of cold water. Not anger, exactly. Anger is hot and moves fast and spends itself. This was colder than that. This was the thing that stays. "Webb," I said. "He's still in Billings?" "Don't know." "Maybe. You want to go to him?" She thought about that. Long enough that I could tell she was being honest with herself, not just answering. "I don't know that either," she said finally. "I thought I did. Now I don't know what I want." "That's all right," I said. "You've got time." I left her to rest. The next 3 days were their own kind of weather. Word got around the valley, the way word always does. Not the true version. The version that Hollis Hartwell told was that his daughter had gone to stay with the Lakota because she had lost her mind to grief over some man who'd left her. That version made Hartwell the suffering father and Clara the unstable girl, which was a neat reversal of what had actually happened, and which I noticed was a version nobody in town particularly questioned, because Hollis Hartwell had been in that valley 30 years, and I had been there since before any of them were born. But my 30 years counted for less to certain men than his. I went to town on the second day to get supplies. I walked into the feed store and the hardware and the general goods, and I did not change my pace or my expression, and I looked at every man who looked at me sidelong, and I held the look until they found something else to examine. I have learned that a man's dignity is, in part, performance, not a dishonest one, but a performance in the old sense. The sense of doing a thing in front of others so that the truth of it becomes established in the room. I was establishing something. I was establishing that Clara Hartwell was under my roof and under my protection, and that I was not embarrassed by it and did not intend to be, and anyone who wanted to make something of that was welcome to come find me. Nobody came. On the third day, Hartwell himself rode up the road to the house. I was on the porch when he came, which was not an accident. I had been watching the road because I expected him. I knew how men like that moved. They needed to reclaim the thing they felt they'd lost, and they needed to do it before the version of events solidified into something permanent. 3 days was about right. He pulled up at the bottom of the porch steps and he did not get down off his horse. It was also not an accident. Staying mounted is a way of staying above a man. I let him have that. It cost me nothing. He said Clara was his daughter, and she was to come home. I said she was a grown woman and the choice was hers. He said a lot of things after that. Some of them were about my people in general, which I have heard before, many times, in many mouths, and which I have found best to let pass through me, without lodging, the way wind passes through fence rails. Some of them were about the law and what rights a father had. I listened to the law ones, because those mattered, I said. She is not a child. She is not livestock. You do not own her, Hollis, and you haven't owned her since she turned 18. Whatever you told yourself in that barn, I kept my voice level. You can come back in a year, and if she wants to see you, she'll see you. Until then, this road ends at my fence. He sat there a moment. His horse moved under him, impatient. Then he left. Clara had heard it from the window of the room she was staying in. Winona told me later that Clara had stood at that window the whole time and had not moved. I don't know what she thought watching it. She didn't tell me right away, and I didn't ask. What I knew was this. I had made an enemy of Hollis Hartwell, which was a thing I had been managing not to do for 3 years over a fence line. And now I had done it over his daughter, and the arithmetic of it was different than I had planned. But a man cannot always choose the timing of when he has to be himself. Sometimes the moment arrives and you are either the man you're trying to be or you're not. And you find out which one right then, with no time to prepare. I found out I was the man I'd been trying to be. That helped. The weeks that followed, and it was weeks, not days, because the wound healed slowly, and because Clara was not a woman who left before she was ready. Those weeks had a texture I still carry. She was not a fragile thing. She helped Winona in the kitchen, and she asked questions about the ranch, how many head, what the winter losses had been, whether I ran cattle on the east pasture, or left it for the elk. She asked about the land in a way that told me she'd thought about land before, thought about what it was, to have a piece of ground that was yours. One afternoon she came out to the corral, where I was working a young horse, a 4-year-old bay gelding that had opinions about being ridden, strong opinions, and I was in the middle of convincing him that my opinion was going to win in the end. She sat the top rail of the corral fence and watched. Didn't say anything, just watched. There is a kind of watching that is judgment, and a kind that is interest, and I have learned to tell the difference, and hers was interest. When I finally got the horse moving easy, she said, "You didn't fight him. No, you just stayed. Until he decided you were all right." Something like that. She was quiet a moment. "My father fights everything," she said. "He thinks that's what strength is." I got down off the horse and let him move around the corral loose. "Strength is knowing when to stay still," I said. "Shh. A man who's always swinging his fist is afraid. A man who can hold his ground without swinging, that's a different thing." She looked at me. The October light was on her face. Same slant orange it had been in the barn when I found her, but different now. "You really believe that?" "It's how I was raised. The Lakota way, my grandfather's way, my father's way." I paused. "My way." She nodded slowly. Ksh. Like she was adding that to something she was building in her mind. I didn't ask what she was building. It wasn't time. November came in cold. First snow was early, a wet, heavy one that bent the pine branches and turned the pastures white overnight. I spent 3 days fixing fence in that cold, the wire stiff, and the posts half frozen in the ground, and Clara brought coffee out to where I was working each morning. Not because Winona asked her to, because she decided to. I noticed the difference. She also brought it the right way. Not making a ceremony of it, not waiting to be thanked, just setting it on the fence post and going back. Except sometimes she stayed, and we talked a little. About the snow, about what the winter would be like. Once about her mother, who had died when Clara was 9. and about how things had been different before that. She told me her mother had a garden, a kitchen garden, and she had the seeds still. In a tin her mother had kept them in. She'd carried the tin out of her father's house in her coat pocket. The morning I found her, she showed it to me once. Old seeds in paper packets, folded and labeled in a woman's handwriting. I held the tin, and I understood what I was holding, which was 30 years of a daughter keeping a piece of her mother alive, and I handed it back carefully. "You'll have your garden," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were doing something I couldn't fully read. It was unusual, because I am usually a good reader of what a face is doing. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean there's a south-facing slope behind the house that gets good sun. The soil's dark. Winona grows her herbs there, but there's room." Clara was still looking at me. "Tall horse," she said, and I noticed she used the name the same as everyone else used it. Easy, without thinking. "Are you saying you want me to stay?" There it was. I had not planned to arrive at it that way, but it had arrived anyway, the way certain things do. Not the moment you aim for, but the one that opens when you're looking somewhere else. I said, "I'm saying the land would hold a garden. What you do with that is your decision." That's a careful answer. I'm a careful man. She set her hands on the top fence post, both of them, and she looked out at the white pasture. The snow had stopped, and the sky was the kind of cold blue that comes after snow, specific and hard and clear. She stood there long enough that I started to think I'd said the wrong thing. That the careful answer was too careful, that a woman sometimes needs a man to just say the plain thing. Then she said quietly to the pasture, "I'm not going to Billings." I waited. I wrote to Aldous. Last week. Winona helped me post it. She turned and looked at me again, direct, same as the first time she'd looked at me. He was a good man, probably. But I wrote and told him I wouldn't be coming. I said nothing. "I'm telling you that," she said, "because I want you to know what I decided. And why." "Why?" She was quiet a moment. The blue sky behind her, the white pasture, the bare cottonwood branches. "Because I spent a month watching you," she said. "I watched how you moved through your own land. I watched how you talked to Winona, and how you talked to my father, and how you worked that horse." She paused. "I've met men who wanted to own things, and I've met men who were afraid of things. And then I watched you, and you're neither one. You're just sure of yourself, quiet about it. You don't need anyone to know it." She looked at me steadily. "I've never met a man like that before, and I don't think I should leave a man like that if I can help it." The cold was around us, both of us standing by that fence in November. And what I felt was not what I would have expected to feel. I would have expected something large and rushing. What I felt was more like something coming to rest. Like a long-held tension going out of a rope, I said. "Then stay." She nodded, once. The same small nod Winona used when she'd decided something was settled. We did not touch then. That came later. What we did was stand there a moment longer, both looking out at the pasture, and then I said, I had another fence section to fix before dark, and she said she'd bring more coffee at noon. And that was how it was between us for a while. Practical, close, honest, which is, I have found, a better foundation than most. The winter was hard. 3 cows lost to a cold snap in January. A week where the temperature dropped fast and stayed, and we fought to keep the rest of the herd alive. Clara and I and 2 of my men working in shifts through the nights. The lanterns burning in the barn, breath smoking in the cold. She was not a delicate woman. She worked like someone who understood that the land required it, that there was no special consideration given for being tired or cold, that the animals needed what they needed, and you provided it, or you didn't. She didn't ask to be sheltered from it. She was in it, alongside me. There was a night in the middle of that week, when we had been awake most of 2 days, and we were sitting on a hay bale, in the barn, at something like 3 in the morning, too tired to go back to the house, and she leaned against me. Just leaned, the side of her head against my shoulder, and her eyes closed. She was not asleep. I could tell by her breathing, but she was resting. and she had decided that my shoulder was where she would rest. I did not move. I sat there in the cold barn, with the cattle shifting and breathing around us and a woman's head on my shoulder, and I felt, first time in a long time, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not where I had planned to be. Not where anyone had told me I should be. Where something actual had led me. I thought about my grandfather, who had told me, when I was young, that a man's life has a shape to it, and the shape only becomes clear when you stop fighting the direction of things and start paying attention to where they're actually going. I had fought a lot of directions in my life. The county over land rights. The men who looked at me like I was a disruption in their idea of what this valley should be. My own loneliness, which I had treated, for years, like a condition to be managed, rather than a wound to be healed. This woman had come into my life sideways, the way the best things come, through an ugly door and into something I hadn't been looking for. And she had looked at me like I was worth looking at, not because I had anything she needed. Because she had seen something true about me that I had spent years wondering if anyone would ever see. That is not a small thing. For a man who has been looked past and looked around and looked through, it is not a small thing at all. Spring came slow and cold and then suddenly warm, the way springs do in that country, grudging for weeks and then generous all at once. The south slope behind the house thawed out in March, and Clara started turning the soil with a mattock, working at it in the afternoons, and I would sometimes watch from a distance while I was doing other work. She moved like she had done this before, and forgotten she knew how, and was now remembering. The tin of seeds went out in April, in careful rows that she had thought about all winter, and Winona came out and looked at the rows and said something in Lakota that I did not catch all of. Clara looked at me, and I told her Winona was saying the rows were good, which was true, and was also the highest praise Winona ever gave anything. By May, she had made that slope her own. It was greening up along the rows, things coming up that I couldn't name. Her mother's seeds, her mother's plants, and she would come in from it in the evenings with dirt on her hands. And her face open in a way I had learned, over the winter, was her particular expression of contentment. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something settled. We were married in June, by a minister from the nearest town, who drove out with 2 witnesses and conducted a simple thing on the south porch in the morning light. No guests, which was Clara's choice. She said the people who needed to know would know, which turned out to be true. Word moved through the valley like it always did, and I imagine different people felt different ways about it, and I gave that about as much attention as I gave to what Hollis Hartwell thought about anything, which was nearly none. We didn't have rings yet. We went to town for them a week later, on a Thursday, and walked into the jeweler's side by side. The jeweler, a small man named Fuchs, who had been in the valley since before I was born, and who had always been, to his credit, even with me, measured her finger, and my finger, and we chose plain silver bands. Nothing elaborate. Because neither of us needed the elaborate version of things. Walking out of that store, back into the June sun, her hand in mine, I thought about the barn and the iron and the sound she'd made. And I thought about the long winter and the cold nights and the snow that had bent the pine branches. And I thought about her head on my shoulder in the dark, and the tin of seeds and the rows in the south slope. A man cannot choose what comes at him. He can only choose what he does when it arrives. I had made the choices I could make, and they had led here. A good woman beside me, her hand in mine, June morning, in a valley that was mine and now was hers, walking out into the ordinary sun. The jeweler's door closed behind us. Hand was warm. The sun was high. That is where the story belongs. Right there, at the edge of the ordinary day that comes after everything else.